Dobry večera and greetings from Ukraine. I'm back here in Odessa and welcome to the weekly Sunday state of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the big news in the last week has been the decision by Sweden to sign an agreement with Ukraine to supply grippe, I think is the pronunciation in Swedish. Anyone who knows better can comment below. But basically, Sweden is going to the original understanding was over the medium to long-term supply up to 150 odd fighter jets to the Ukrainian military. This is obviously going to expand dramatically Ukraine's capacity in terms of being able to use its air force. Neither side in the Russo-Ukrainian war has air superiority. Surprisingly, Russia has not been able to achieve that in over a decade of war, but since the 2022 invasion, that had been expected that it would have air dominance. However, neither side has been able to achieve that. Ukraine has received older Soviet planes from its allies in addition to F-16s, which are the US fighter that is not the most advanced. They did not get F-35s. However, they do get those F-16s, which are comparable to what the Russian military has. Doesn't give Ukraine necessarily an advantage, significant advantage, but they are in the same type of sphere. And these Gripa, one of the big advantages is that they were designed to be able to take off without proper airfields, and the fact that they were going to receive potentially up to 150. And since they announced the agreement, there are a lot of rumors that they will get them actually in 2026 already. So it's not going to be really medium term, but they will start to receive these jets in the short term, which is surprising because normally for a new jet, you would need some time to train pilots. So perhaps Ukraine has actually been training pilots to fly the Swedish aircraft for the last few years. And that would mean that they're actually already up to speed. But let's see what happens. That is something that has been mooted since the 2022 invasion. Didn't happen until now. So finally, albeit over 3.5 years later, Ukraine will receive those Swedish aircraft, and they will definitely help with the balance of power in the air. Won't give Ukraine air superiority or air dominance, but will definitely go a long way to allowing Ukraine to be able to use its air force more constructively and further weaken the Russian position. At this stage, famously, because I'm just here, I can see the Black Sea from my window here. Russia started off with the Black Sea Fleet and supposedly having sea dominance. However, even though Ukraine scuttled a large proportion of its remaining fleet back in 2022, and they thought it might be captured in Mykolaiv, Russia basically is not in a position to actually use its fleet at all because it cannot come close enough to Ukraine. It is at this point, I think nearly all of it is basically been banished back to Russia proper. It's not even in occupied Crimea anymore. It is in Novorossiysk, although the Russians are building some sort of new facility further down the coast in parts of Georgia that are not under the central Georgian government's control in Abkhazia. So maybe they were going to build some alternative facility down there. However, you see that even though the Russians started off with a significant advantage in terms of the Navy, it has been rendered more or less insignificant. Famously, the Ukrainians also sunk the main Russian flagship, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, back in 2022 with their own home-developed munitions. So that is great news for Ukraine. Another news that's also positive for Ukraine, the US has or will impose some sanctions. There is kind of I think about a month of lead-in period on Russian resource industries. And whilst there are no secondary sanctions yet, it seems like the Trump administration has realized that they need to increase the pressure on Russia in order to try and compel them to make some concessions in some sort of peace agreement. Personally, I'm very skeptical if there's any realistic opportunity for any sort of peace settlement. Basically, both sides are pretty much keeping to their positions that they had, we'll say, late 2022. Russia effectively wants Ukraine to capitulate, and Ukraine wants Russia to leave, pay compensation, etc. But definitely they are not going to sign over legally any of the occupied territory in Ukraine, and Russia, under its current leadership, doesn't seem to be want to give up on that. So we will see what impact these sanctions actually have. Russia's economy is in dire straits, as I've been saying for almost 2 years now. This geopolitics channel I started over a year ago, so at least on this channel since its inception in the second half of 2025, it has been clear for a long time that Russia needs solutions to three big problems: lack of manpower, lack of money, and lack of material. They have, to a certain extent, with material, they're now producing some of it with North Korean workers, but really they have actually changed tactics. They don't use, for example, their armored vehicles as much as they did in the past. It's because they've worn down so much of the Soviet era stocks. So basically, at the moment, they don't really have their solution is just to change tactics. Therefore, they would use more infantry and presumably lose more infantry than they would if they were able to use armored vehicles. And that has been their solution so far. For respect to manpower, they had increased dramatically the salaries. However, recently it seems that they have now changed the law, and there is the possibility they will soon not actually have a full official mobilization, but they will start to deploy reservists from the Russian military and start to deploy them in Ukraine, probably in a more support capacity in the beginning, not directly in the front lines, but then that would free up soldiers who are in support roles, and they would basically be compelled to go to the front line. That could buy Russia a significant amount of time because they do have about 2 million reservists. However, there is also the possibility that many of those reservists will flee the country, further weakening the Russian economy. And that brings us to the money issue and how the sanctions impact that. Russia is more and more dependent on its war economy and selling its resources to fund that. And basically, they have now interest rates over 20%, even using the official figures, inflation over 10%, and are in real danger of seeing their economy start to weaken even further. They spend 40% of their budget, over 40% of their budget, on this war and internal security. That is a massive number. It's close to 7 or 8%. Just trying to think off the top of my head. It's 7% of GDP. That is sustainable, but the problem is if you have a weakening economy, then that will proportionally become a higher and higher part of GDP, and something over 10% would probably be unsustainable. So we're not quite at that point, and the sanctions could have a significant impact. Would Vladimir Putin calculate that he needs a pause in this conflict, not as a full cessation or a peace agreement because he can't get the terms that he wants? It's possible that we would see that. However, it looks like Vladimir Putin is not willing to gamble on a pause right now. He would see it as a significant threat to his own position. He would basically need to find a way of not having the military come home because they would present a significant threat to his power. And the only real way to do that is to find a justification to have them deployed somewhere else. They could involve launching a significant provocation on a NATO state or attacking a non-NATO state. Non-NATO states that border Russia include Mongolia, Kazakhstan, for example, maybe somewhere in the, they don't really have a reason to attack Georgia since the government is currently very pro-Russian. So that is a possibility. However, that would be a major gamble by the Kremlin to launch a significant provocation against NATO with risking basically a response from NATO that they probably wouldn't be able to cope with. So for now, it looks like Putin will continue going for a maximalist position and not pausing the war. That might change, especially if the economy is weakened further and further. There have been significant rumors and accusations by Russia of a potential coup d'etat against Vladimir Putin, led by Khodorkovsky, who is a former Russian oligarch who was imprisoned by the Putin government way back. It's definitely over 10 years ago. It's maybe close to 20 at this point. And he lives in exile. If you think back to 2023, we had the Prigozhin mutiny, as it's called, attempted mutiny, Was it really a full attempt at a coup d'etat? Well, it didn't have the support within the elites, so it fizzled out rather quickly, and Prigozhin was subsequently killed in a plane accident. But it's about the same as having an accident falling out of a window of a 12-story building in Russia. So presumably he was eliminated by the Putin government. So strong possibility, since they're talking about it. Also, Russia has moved a lot of its air defense around Moscow. Several reasons for that. One is if they are genuinely scared of it in another attempted coup d'etat, then protecting the seat of power becomes more important. And also, they want to insulate the population of Moscow from the effects of the war as much as possible, because the center of power is there and they don't want a hostile local populace. So if you look at what the Russian, I guess we can call him opposition figure at this point, Igor Girkin, he is the architect and implementer of the invasion of Crimea and of the parts of the Donbass back in 2014. He now sits in a Russian prison, not because he's pro-Western, but because he is a threat to Vladimir Putin's power, as he is a ultra-nationalist in Russia who has a pretty good record and understanding of the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war. He sees very little possibility that Russia can win with Putin as leader with his strategy, and he sees it more likely that either Ukraine will win entirely and regain all control of all its territory, or there will be some sort of pause at some stage where Russia doesn't win and is weakened in the long term. So that is also a figure who could be potentially biding his time if there were some sort of attempted coup d'etat. Definitely within the elite in Russia, it is likely that there is a lot of unhappiness because of the way the war has gone, with no end in sight. On the battlefield, they are making peaceful progress. And I put it into GTP as in preparation for one of these videos here about how long it would take for Russia to win a current progress. And ChatGTP said never, basically. They just thought that the current rate of progress, they would take them so long even to get the river Dnieper, which runs through the center of Ukraine, and they have no way getting across that. Basically, it is mission impossible. So either Russia needs to cut off all support for Ukraine. Even that probably wouldn't work at this point. In order to, well, I guess if they cut off all financial support, maybe that would have a greater impact. But definitely, even if they manage to cut off all military support from the US, which at the moment there isn't really that much significant military support outside of the intel, which the US does supply. However, that is Putin's strategy, is to keep going forward and hope that he gets a favorable change politically to cut off that support, and eventually Ukraine will be forced to capitulate. But so many things can go wrong in the meantime, especially if the Russian economy continues to weaken and there is discontent amongst the Russian elite. I'm not personally someone who thinks that there's going to be a revolution that is going to be led by a mass uprising in Russia. However, the possibility of another coup d'etat, because we already have the precedent with Prigozhin, especially if it meant perhaps Girkin being released from prison and him being involved, definitely there is a possibility of that. So those are the things to look out for. Gripin's incoming, very little progress on the battlefield by Russia in general for the last 2 years, and that looks like it is going to continue to slow. The weather here, it is not raining today, but it was even raining yesterday. It's definitely not weather for making big advances, and the Russian economy will continue to weaken in spite of being able to get around a lot of the sanctions. But the cumulative effect of fighting a war, which is very expensive, plus having issues with selling your main exports, mean that the Russian economy will slowly but surely continue to weaken. And Russia does not have a clear way to solve its money problem, which has spill-on effects into their ability to procure material and manpower. So those are things to look out for in terms of effects over the next week or so. And I will be back with more videos this week. I managed to go through all my backlog with respect to the lifestyle channel. So if you're enjoying this content, drop a comment down below about what you'd like to see me comment on this week in the videos on my channel, and drop any comments and thoughts you have down below. If you're coming to Ukraine, of course, look in the description to this live stream. You have my guide for coming here, help support this channel while I am continue to grow at the second channel on geopolitics, and I will be back very soon, probably next Sunday, with another geopolitical live stream. So, do побачення, до перемоги, and chat